if there's a cable physically damaged, that must have had an effect on how fast a packet goes from Germany to Finland, right? And we started looking into that, and indeed, you just observe like the equivalent of traffic jams on the internet for the cable breakages that we observe. There's no step change in packet loss. I would expect that not a lot of people, in the grand scheme of things, noticed because of this rerouting happening and its resilience. You have these multiple levels at which things can be redundant. So these three levels work together to provide a very resilient internet.
Submarine internet cables, over 1 million kilometers of which line the ocean floors, are an essential part of the fabric of the internet, allowing high-speed connectivity between countries and continents. In November last year, reports emerged from various sources that 2 such cables in the Baltic Sea had broken: the BCS East-West Interlink cable between Sweden and Lithuania, and the Sea Lion 1 cable between Finland and Germany. While investigation into exactly what led to these and other similar incidents in the months that followed have continued, in the first 2 days after the event, we turned to RIPE Atlas, a global internet measurement system operated by the RIPE NCC, to examine the effect that damage to these cables had on the internet. The data collected by RIPE Atlas, which is publicly available to all internet researchers, showed that while these incidents certainly had an impact, the internet appears to have remained resilient to them, thanks to multiple levels of redundancy. Our analysis, published across 2 RIPE Labs articles, was led by Emile Aben, Specialist Research Engineer at the RIPE NCC, and author of a number of earlier RIPE Labs articles on how the internet routes around damage. Emile and I sat down to talk about how RIPE Atlas helped shed light on the situation in the Baltic Sea, how the resilience of the internet has evolved, and why it's important for the technical community to keep monitoring, understanding, and sharing insights on how the internet holds up against these kinds of outages. I'm Alan Davies, the RIPE Labs editor, and this is the RIPE Labs podcast.
3 years ago, we did the first ever episode of the RIPE Labs podcast together. And at the time, you were talking about how you could use RIPE Atlas to gain visibility into incidents, outages, various events that impact the internet. Back then, you were looking at Ukraine. What was special about Ukraine that you saw when you started to measure the internet there?
I think at that point, at least I had the expectation that the internet there would be quickly destroyed, but it showed a remarkable resilience. And then we started looking into reasons for this resilience, right? And you find all kinds of interesting things, like a lot of IXPs, a lot of small networks, a high density of ASNs, a high density of interconnection. So there's a lot of like resilience in that, and in just the fact that if one little piece of the puzzle, or if one little piece breaks, there is always a backup option. And as long as there's a backup option, the internet will route around damage.
In the case of Ukraine, that was largely, I think in the analysis that you put together, that largely came down to the huge number of ASNs in the country.
Yes, a huge number of ASNs. They are quite well connected to the outside world. We quickly saw a disconnect between Ukrainian and Russian networks. Ukraine kept being connected to outside networks, and we saw a slight decrease there, but it kept connected. And as long as there was power, the internet kept running. There was enough diversity at all kinds of levels that if one of the pieces failed, other pieces were there to back it up. So, and that's sort of like a remarkable resilience that we saw there.
So the lesson there is just, creating a really diverse set of networks with lots of paths out of country, lots of paths between those networks. That creates resilience.
I think it evolves that way. It's not that there's like a grand designer that directs interconnects for the internet. It's more that networks interconnect because that is sort of like how they evolve. They become better. They have resiliency for the customers. That way, it all balances out. And if you don't have enough diversity, then in case of an outage, you just deliver bad service and you sort of like evolve out of the picture. And this way, all of these networks have evolved into what they are now.
That was what we were talking about 3 years ago. And now, so obviously in November, we started to hear reports that damage had occurred to cables across the Baltic Sea. One of the things I want to focus on here a bit is how it is that you actually use RIPE Atlas to understand this better and to get a view into what was going on, and how it revealed some stuff maybe we weren't expecting to see at first. So just to get a clearer picture of that, when you first heard of these reports about damage to these cables, what was your first move in terms of looking at it in RIPE Atlas?
Earlier in the year, we had looked a bit deeper at something we call the RIPE Atlas anchor mesh. So that is like we have RIPE Atlas anchors. That's a couple of hundreds of servers worldwide that measure latencies between themselves in a mesh. They are geographically distributed. And just a quick scan of that data revealed that, for instance, there's a cable between Germany and Finland. And if you actually look at how many of these anchors we have in Germany and Finland, that is actually quite a diversity of these devices that every 4 minutes they measure the latency between themselves. So I was wondering if there's a cable physically got damaged, that must have had an effect on how fast a packet goes from Germany to Finland, right? And we started looking into that, and indeed, you can identify some of the path without actually going into what caused this latency or what caused packet loss. You just observe like the equivalent of traffic jams on the internet. So normally it takes an hour to drive from A to B, and now it takes 2 hours to drive from A to B. So something happened in between.
Yeah.
And for a fraction of the path there, off the top of my head, like 30% or something, we saw a latency increase that you could actually measure.
So like we see this signal in terms of this step in latency, and that really helped you to zone in on the exact time of the event.
Yes.
At that time when you see this change in latency, you don't see any simultaneous change in packet loss.
No,
there.
that was quite surprising for many of these outages that we observe, or for the cable breakages that we observe. There's no step change in packet loss. If packet loss typically is a sign of something being at capacity.
Yeah.
So on the internet, if packets get into sort of a traffic jam, they don't get stuck there. They sort of get discarded by the routers because these cannot handle an infinite amount of packets. If the traffic jam becomes too big, you get packet loss.
You do see that like these latencies are going up and down all the time, right? There's a lot of noise there.
It is very noisy. So you see all kinds of things happening all the time. The equivalence of traffic jams, just like the car network, like the road network has predictable patterns when it gets jammed, and sometimes it's unpredictable, except for, I would say, in the road system, it is kind of predictable that like in the morning when people go to work and in the evening when people get back from work, that's when the traffic jams happen. The internet is, at least the data I'm looking at, is quite a bit more erratic.
So, but in the data, in the graphs that you produced, there was this very clear whole bunch of paths between these anchors.
Yes.
Suddenly saw about the same, or like at the same time at least, this interruption or this increase in latency.
Yeah.
In order to distinguish that step from the noise, how did you prepare the data here? I'm thinking more like how you took away the minimum.
Oh, yeah. So if I go from A to B, if I go from Paris to Amsterdam by train, for instance, that will take me 3 hours.
Yeah.
Because that's the speed by which that train goes, basically.
Yeah, all else being equal, that's how long it takes.
So what I did, and for internet packets to go from Germany to Finland, they take 10, 20, 30 milliseconds. So what I did is I took the minimum out of all of the time series that I have, which I take as, this is how fast the internet can go at full speed. And I subtracted that to the actual signal that I saw. So if we are two RIPE Atlas anchors, there's always 20 milliseconds of latency when a packet goes from me to you and back. And now it becomes 25. So that's like 5 milliseconds extra delay. So I take this baseline, and quite often when there's nothing wrong, the signal typically shows 20 milliseconds, 20 milliseconds. So if I just subtract that minimum off of the full signal, and now there's another thing from Amsterdam to Rome,
Yeah.
That's more than a day of train travel. You cannot compare Amsterdam to Paris, Amsterdam to Rome, if you just take the absolute values. But if you subtract the minimum values, they become comparable. So in this way, you can compare the latencies between different points that all go across the same medium. By baselining, you can see the outlining, the outliers better.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
that was one technique we actually used for getting the signal out of the raw data that we have.
Yeah. So that latency shift, that kind of step that you see, and it's a very clear step in the data. That's basically the internet rerouting. Right, rerouting. I've got to decide how I'm going to say that one day. That's the internet rerouting around the damage.
The internet could reroute at the same latency, but if you see such a clear latency shift, that is a telltale sign of rerouting. We also see cable repairs, and the cable repair ships actually send messages out that can be read by people. If you follow these, then you can actually see when these cable repair ships are done with their work, and then you can actually see latency going from high to low again. And now, if there's enough RIPE Atlas anchors around, we can easily figure out from this how many of the path between them were affected. And of course, this is how well we can see this depends on the number of vantage points. So there are very interesting areas in the world where there's a lot of cables, and there's also quite some cable breakages because of tectonic activity and landslide, undersea landslides, for instance, that we have little insights on because we don't have RIPE Atlas anchors that are at one. You need Atlas anchors at both sides of such, or vantage points. Any vantage point at both sides of such cables. So, for instance, in Africa, it would be really interesting to have more RIPE Atlas anchors deployed there. And also even some of the Baltic countries, for instance, Latvia, would be great to have a little bit more of anchors and a little bit more of diversities of these anchors, so we could better monitor what's going on and to what extent we see this routing around damage in action.
Yeah. And by diversity there, you mean located in different AS?
If you have a single network in a single city, you don't know if this was just an effect you see for that network or for that city. So I would like to have diversity in both the geographic locations, so the cities, and in the different networks. My wish would be to have like 5 of these RIPE Atlas anchors in at least 3 cities in at least 3 different ASNs for each country.
Like we see this signal in terms of this step in latency,
Yeah.
and that really helped you to zone in on the exact time of the event.
Yes.
Because the anchor mesh is performing quite regular measurements, right?
Yes,
So you
every 4 minutes you have like a ping result, which contains 3 round trip times. And I try to do everything based on the minimum of these, because that basically gives you like a base latency. And when you have an exact time, you can actually start looking at different levels of resiliency.
The interesting thing is in the way that you presented the data in that initial article, as you said, Josh, at that time when you see this change in latency, you don't see any simultaneous change in packet loss.
No,
there.
There's no step change in packet loss. Packet loss typically is a sign of something being at capacity.
Yeah.
So from this, you can actually conclude that there's enough capacities. If the internet is like a 6-lane highway, if there's 2 lanes in use, then it's easy to reroute another 2 lanes back onto that. Then it still isn't at capacity. It's not just about rerouting to another path. It's also a signal that there was enough capacity on that path for packets to just be transmitted without loss.
So for the end user, for the average end user, they'll have noticed nothing. As long as there was no big change in packet loss, there'll have been very little change in...
Yeah, so it is very difficult because every end user is different. So if you happened to be using something which is very latency sensitive, for instance, if you're a musician, you do online music, latency kills. So then maybe like this 20 millisecond extra might have just pushed the barrier on being able to do a live collaborative performance over the internet or not.
Yeah, sure, yeah.
But then if you were watching cat videos, these cat videos probably come from a local cache. Like we're here in Amsterdam.
Sure, yeah.
If I watch a cat video, it's probably going to come from a cache here in Amsterdam. And I would guess Finnish and German internet users, they would be using caches in Helsinki or the Frankfurt area. So I don't think they would have noticed anything about these types of cable cuts.
Okay, so a major cable across the Baltic Sea gets cut, and really the impact for the outside world is oddly a blip in terms of...
Again, I would expect that not a lot of people, in the grand scheme of things, noticed because of this rerouting happening and its resilience.
Great. Okay, I think that gets us to through the kind of point of the initial analysis, because that's what I think the message of the first article is, that the internet managed to route around. The internet managed to, I can't say route. The internet managed to route around the damage done. But following up that analysis, you then turned to look at other data available there. I mean, you've been talking about ping measurements, which is just like end-to-end latency, basically.
Yeah.
Like
it is. You send a packet, and first you notice, did the packet come back? If not, you record loss. And the other thing is, how much time did it take the packet to go there and come back?
Yeah.
That's all there is to that.
So you're getting latency and packet loss out of those simple ping measurements.
Yes.
Okay. But then in order to really look at how the rerouting was taking place and how the internet was routing around damage there, you turned to traceroute data.
Yes.
And that was like the next step in the analysis.
That's the next step. From the ping measurements, from the latency shift, we actually see, hey, it actually happened right here. So now you have a timestamp, and you can just look at what did it look like before that, what did it look like after that. You can sort of like zoom into the details of how that routing looked like.
Okay, so before you go into that a little bit, just like thinking about what a traceroute actually shows you, what do you see along the traceroute when you're looking at it?
Well, the traceroute goes from, well, in this case, it's the anchor mesh. So it's from an anchor to an anchor. At each step of the way, of the forward path, you actually see the IP address of a router that forwards along this path.
Right, okay, yeah.
So now you have the source, a bunch of IP addresses of routers, and the latency at which these routers are relative to your source.
Okay, yeah.
That's the data that you have. And from these, you can infer which network the packets traversed through, which IXP they went through. Sometimes even looking at the physical network maps, you can figure out what these routes look like.
Yeah.
So where the path physically goes.
Yeah.
And we have this from... A traceroute is a bit peculiar that you can only see a forward path, so from A to B.
Yeah.
But the internet routes asymmetrically, like where with cars and trains, you typically A to B is B to A. The internet goes like from A to B, it goes one way, and from B to A, it might go another way.
Yeah.
Quite often that is different, which also tells you something about the resiliency, because if there was not a lot of like diversity there, you would have the same path. But this already is a sign of, hey, there's a lot of routing options available.
Yeah. So something when we were sitting down and you're talking about the data and you're showing me visualizations and we're putting together these articles, one concept that came up in this second article was this idea that there are different levels of resilience.
Yeah.
And that's something that came out of that traceroute data.
Yeah.
So it was straightforward enough to me to think about the traffic passing through different ASNs, right?
Yeah.
Seeing different ASCs along the path. But that's not the full story, right?
When you look at this traceroute data, then sometimes you know a path got rerouted because you see a latency shift happening. So you know something changed.
Yeah.
And then you look at this traceroute path on the forward and on the backward. And for the couple of hours that I looked before and after and compared, they were exactly the same. So something changed, but what we can observe from the path is the same.
Okay. So that means that the same, This wasn't for all of them, though, right?
No. This was like the what I think the most interesting form of resiliency is the resiliency at the circuit level.
Okay, so before we jump to that level, so what are these 3 different levels of resiliency identified as you're looking at?
One of them, let's start with inter-domain, so between networks, between ASNs. Like if one network has a catastrophic failure, let's call it that. Say now let's look at airplanes. Let's look at airports. So let's take air flights from Prague to Lisbon.
Okay.
So from our last RIPE meeting to our next RIPE meeting, and there's different airlines flying from between these airports. So now one airline goes bankrupt.
Yeah, okay.
That's kind of in concept, it's similar to routing around damage. Then all the passengers that were on that will go to the other airline. And as long as that airline has enough capacity, that type of system also routes around the damage of a bankrupt organization.
Yeah, okay.
So in internet, it's the same. So you have like 2 networks and there's different parties that do transit between them. If one of the transit providers has a failure, doesn't propagate routes or something, then the BGP protocol kicks in, and if a route is not available anymore, BGP will select the next best path and make that the best path. So that's resiliency at the BGP, at the inter-AS level. There's a second level, intra-AS rerouting.
Okay.
So this is where, say there's 2 networks and there's one network in between that routes the traffic between them. So if this network in between, if something happens there, that network will have like an internal routing protocol. It's like OSPF or ISIS or well, this is not my area of expertise.
Yeah, sure.
So these protocols will interact with BGP, and if there's a failure that can be routed around within the network, then like these internal routing protocols internal to the network, OSPF or ISIS, they will route around the damage. So then it's sort of like you might not see it externally in BGP data, but the network operators within that network will see all these things like link failures that they route around and stuff like that.
So we could describe the first one in terms of that's stuff that's visible in BGP, and there's a different AS path basically, and then with the second one is more of a difference in terms of the IP addresses of these routers, right?
Yes, the IP addresses of the routers are different before and after an event. Whereas if you just look at the AS path, that's the same for that level of rerouting. And then you have like a third one, which I find the most fascinating. That is where you see a latency shift.
Yeah.
So something happened, but the IP path is exactly the same before and after an event happened. As I understand the industry, people are buying these circuits either protected or unprotected, and a protected circuit basically means you have fiber or something running along a fiber that when the fiber breaks, whoever you take the service from will reroute you to another fiber.
Right. Okay.
Reroute as in on the optical level. Or the other thing that could do something like this, where it's not visible in traceroute data, would be MPLS. So that's like you have a virtual circuit running. So if a link fails, there needs to be something in there about MPLS.
In order for that to happen, an organization has to presumably have invested quite a lot in protecting these routes, right? If it's going to, like, if you're actually going to go to that length, I assume this costs something to create the
I'm blissfully unaware of the difference in pricing for this, but I'm sure that people who are deep into the running networks like this, they will know the differences of pricing between these protected or unprotected networks.
So you could have 2 routers. One of the paths between them goes across, say, Sea Lion 1, but there's an alternative path between them that doesn't use that cable at all. So you see the latency shift as it goes around the other route, but you don't see any change in IP address along the trace route.
We actually were digging down into an example of a network, and this was another outage of the cable between Latvia and Sweden.
Yeah.
where we have a network map of a network that uses that cable, so it buys capacity on that cable. But if you look at the physical network map of that particular network, it also shows routes via Finland. So then you have like a direct path or an indirect path if you go from Stockholm to Vilnius.
Yeah.
So indeed, in the trace routes, before we see Stockholm, next hop is Vilnius. And after the cable damage, you see like a 5 to 10 millisecond increase. So the most likely explanation for that is we know the cable got cut, and we know from the network map that there's an alternative available via Finland, that the traffic indeed, or the path indeed shifted on this circuit level.
Yeah.
First, it used the Sweden-Latvia cable, and now it used a longer, more secure, a longer path.
Yeah, yeah, sure.
It used a longer path, but it still went between the same routers. We see the same IP addresses. So you have these multiple levels at which things can be redundant. Some are less visible than others. These layers work together. Like if there's no backup, no circuit level backup, then the internal routing protocol of a network can sort of like route around link failures. And if a single network becomes severed into several pieces, it won't be able to transit stuff. So that is, like, I would say, critical damage. And then BGP can kick in. So you can use an alternative transit provider. So these three levels work together to provide a very resilient internet.
Yeah. Is all the internet like this? Or is the internet around the Baltic Sea special in this sense?
What scares me a little bit is that we don't know, or that I haven't found anybody who can tell me how resilient it is. What we can do is we can observe what happens if one link gets cut. Around the Baltic Sea, there's enough, it looks like there's enough terrestrial fiber or other subsea cables that could pick this up. So I'm actually not too worried there. But for instance, what you can see with places that have known bottlenecks, we have an interesting Ripe Labs article years ago that we wrote about the internet in North Korea, for instance.
Right, okay.
That has limited diversity, probably a single fiber, maybe two upstreams. But at the time we wrote it, it went down quite often, and it's sort of like this island off the coast of France. Sometimes it's connected, sometimes it's disconnected. If you only have like a single fiber strand, there's no diversity. So if something goes wrong there's no backups. And for instance, islands in the Pacific that have like a single submarine cable going into them, they're very susceptible to things happening to the single fiber.
Yeah.
And of course, there's still satellite backup, but satellite doesn't scale to the extent that the internet signal scales via fiber.
Okay.
The physics of that are just amazing, and the amount of signal that people can get through a fiber nowadays, it's amazing.
Since we reported on the first breakages to the cables in the Baltic Sea back in November, there's been this slew of further breaks and damage and lots of things happening. And obviously everybody is really watching this quite closely at the moment. But these events are relatively common, right?
It's quite common. Although if you just do the math and probabilities, I don't know if the frequency in the Baltic Sea that we see currently is an anomaly or not.
Building a lot of redundancy into your networks is a healthy way to build the internet. Right. And these cases speak to why that's a good mindset to have.
And with it, like if there's things that help facilitate this redundancy, like making it lower cost. For instance, this is not particularly about like subsea cables. For instance, IXPs will lower cost of doing interconnections. That's an example of something that helps build a resilient internet. Yeah. And a diversity of paths. If you look at it at the country level, a diversity of paths going in and out of a country certainly helps. And even from a conceptual standpoint, if you have like 10 fibers coming into your country, or you have one, it's kind of obvious which configuration is the more resilient one, right?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, good. And can we talk just a little bit more about IXPs? Because
Sure.
like they obviously play an important role in ensuring resiliency and creating more peering connections at IXPs and things like this. What is that role exactly? How does that help build better resilience?
It allows network operators to offload traffic locally. So it keeps local traffic local. So you don't have to traverse all kinds of expensive and maybe long paths to go from A to B.
Yeah.
So you don't want to go from, take the Amsterdam to Paris example again. You don't want to go through New York to Paris.
So that's at the kind of, that's one way that organizations can build their networks to be more resilient. And another thing that's obviously like a lesson learned here is that this provisioning of more redundancy by building more paths at the circuit level, as you've described it, is obviously another step that organizations can take to make sure their networks remain resilient under damage.
Things look resilient. And so for these outages, we see routing around damage. And I think it's important that we keep observing that. And the moment we start seeing packet loss, for instance, things were at capacity at some point. And of course, for that, we need vantage points. We need places where we can observe this. So this is where these RIPE Atlas anchors come in. Luckily for Germany and Finland, for instance, we have quite a nice number. Both the number and the diversity allow us to be more firm in the conclusions that we can take from this. But for instance, in Latvia, I would love to have more these RIPE Atlas anchors deployed, because that will allow us to better monitor terrestrial connections also between the Baltic states and across the Baltic Sea, how these hold up.
Yeah, good. And of course, like at the moment, the reality is that even like the distribution of RIPE Atlas probes and anchors around that particular region is quite solid, relatively speaking.
Yes.
There have been other cases where it seems that cables have been broken or damaged in other ways that we just haven't been able to look at so clearly, right?
There's quite some interesting cables around Africa, for instance. They go through interesting places like there's submarine landslides, there's tectonics, and so there's breakage there. And whereas I think in South Africa we have a decent amount of RIPE Atlas anchors, but along the African coasts it would be great to have a little bit more deployed so we can better look at the resiliency of the local internets and more deployed, more RIPE Atlas anchors there, both in terms of numbers and diversity, would certainly help.
As somebody who's doing research into this stuff, why is the resilience of the internet something that you think it's important to focus on and monitor?
There's this quote from, I think it's Lord Kelvin, "To measure is to improve." So that's why I really like to figure out how to measure this, so then we know what's going on. Like it's great that there is resilience. It's great that your packets get rerouted in case of damage. Providing some visibility into the fact that this system works and it keeps working might even act as a deterrent. If people actually want to sabotage things, this is probably not the thing that you can easily sabotage. So, and our data shows it routes around damage.
So the internet has like evolved to be this way, but that doesn't mean that like a lot of active decisions had to be made in order to build this resilience, right?
Yeah. Any measure that encourages networks to be resilient. I don't have answers here, just questions or observations. I only have observations.
But this is an interesting thing, right? I mean, there's the question here of, as you said at the start, the internet has evolved to be resilient because it's in the interest of networks not to be flawed by damage. So the organizations running the internet want resilience. So
you'll go out of, like, if your ISP doesn't deliver the package half the time, you have a crappy ISP and you'll go to the competitor. So as long as there is a good ISP nearby, and I would guess the same goes for if you have a transit network and it does a crappy job for you, you'll go to another transit network. Or if you lease capacity on a cable and it doesn't perform the way you do, you either have another cable that you buy and you configure your network so it it routes around the damage. And it's like, in the end, we're dealing with physical systems and things break. So no matter how perfect your design is, if you don't build for some redundancy, things will break. And people have gotten very good at managing how to do things, how to route around this damage. So as long as people are facilitated in doing so, simple things like good training on how this actually works, exchange of information of how people, like network operator groups in countries. There's a lot of these happening within our service region, elsewhere, very large ones, very small ones, where people exchange how they actually do stuff. So these types of things, like capacity building or however you call it, that's important. And that's RIPE meetings are another venue where people exchange ideas, people try to figure out if they should peer.
So the way that the community interacts together is when we often talk about, how the community builds the internet together. Resilience is kind of one of the key notions in there. That's something that you're constantly trying to build into the system.
And at all levels, it's not just like the technical. If you look at this at a country level, have enough people that know how to do this. If you look at outsourcing, if all countries depend on a single country for their knowledge about how the internet works, that is also like a bottleneck, right? You need resilience at all levels.
So as well as having a variety of different paths, you've also got to think about what's the capacity across those paths, right?
If you just look at how networks are provisioned, I think the equipment goes in for multiple years. So people build these networks for growth. So you will not run these lines at 100% utilization all the time.
Yeah.
And there's like a diurnal patterns. So I would guess there's a lot of spare capacity on links. So then it becomes a very distributed problem, right? If you have like 1,000 links that are all at 10% utilization, then if one fails, nobody notices, and the load gets distributed across all the other ones, nobody notices.
Yeah.
Whereas if it's 2 links at 60% capacity, one fails, then you would have to deal with 120% of your traffic on the single link.
Yeah, yeah.
But I don't know of good data sets that could shed some more light into this. So,
so obviously we've put together a number of articles on this already on RIPE Labs, and over the years, this latest article is just one in a series of articles about whether the internet routes around damage that you've been putting together for perhaps a decade now, I think. Maybe
I guess.
Not quite that long. But obviously it's really important to keep these conversations going in the community, right?
This is a fascinating industry, I think. I love talking with internet operators, with the people that actually run this stuff at RIPE meetings, at local NOGs, but it is also very diverse. You put up a presentation, for instance, at a RIPE meeting. You get questions afterwards or comments like, hey, this is actually how it works. So, and that's the way you learn about how stuff works in some local contexts. Works different in other contexts. So, and also looking into these cable cuts, you deepen your knowledge to some extent, but there's also a limit to what you can know about this. So I would love to actually learn more about how the nitty-gritty of how that part of the industry works, so could actually iron out some of the misconceptions that are built into the models that we are currently making. So if people have an interest in this, in helping out there, I would love to talk with them about stuff like that.
Thank you very much for coming and talking to us.
It's been a pleasure.
That's our episode for this month. I do hope you found it interesting, and thanks again to Emile for coming and being a guest on the show. If you did enjoy, remember to like and share. As usual, you can find more information in the show notes, and do join us again next time on the RIPE Labs podcast, when we'll be talking about digital infrastructure and sustainability.